Jeff, I want to talk about moral decision-making, and especially from the viewpoint of the example we get from other people. Aristotle, when he talked about morality, that's to take us back to before Christ, to the great Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Aristotle said that if you want to know what justice is, well, you look at a just person. That was part of the whole Greek outlook, that you learn what morality is all about and how one ought to live by observing people who have mastered the art, who do it well. One of the images for morality that comes out of that culture was that the moral person is like the archer who can hit the target, who can find precisely the fitting thing to do in any situation. And the other image that came out of that culture was that morality has to do with the artist able to find the creative solution to moral dilemmas. So I use that to sort of set a framework here on this question of example and in the whole area of moral decision-making and how we are to learn from other people. I think it gives us a feel for morality that is very contextual, that's earthy, that's real, and not just a matter of logically coming up with principles and following them. You know, there's a study of Lawrence Kohlberg about stages of moral development that many people are into, and his last stage really was the highest, sixth stage of morality, was the person who would know the general principle and act on it. Well, Kohlberg developed that whole theory out of studying only males. And one of his colleagues at Harvard, Carol Gilligan, wrote a book in a different voice saying that, the Kohlberg studies are flawed, because what they missed was the contextual side of moral decision-making. Kohlberg studies used to show that men were generally higher than women in their stages of moral development. And Carol Gilligan says, well, the reason is he studied only men, and he came up with a rationalistic ethic, and that women have a greater sense of context, of story, of relationship, of balancing particular things. It's the kind of thing that morality gives us when we're in a real life situation and we know it isn't as simple as having a principle and using that you discern by reason and then having a strong will to follow it. I mean, people just don't usually operate in that way, whether you're man or woman in our culture. There is something else here that has to do with learning from parents and seeing examples of good people and using that as part of the way we develop morally. That's a long intro, Jeff. You ought to be able to jump in on one or the other of the 10 points I just made.
I guess part of the business you bring up about Carol Gilligan and the critique of Kohlberg, that rings true because, as you say, I think most of us, when we make moral decisions, there's something inside that says, this is what I ought to do, and then we backpedal to kind of build the reasons for why we think that's right. We do our moral reflection sort of in reverse. We have an intuitive grasp of what the right is, or at least the direction that we ought to be moving in, and then as we reflect on that, we may discover that our intuition was flawed for some reason, or that our intuition was right on the money. And it can work the other way, where you really rationally work something out, and then your intuition says, no, this is still wrong. I have to go back and think some more. I think that's really the way people do most of their moral reflection.
Right, and that intuition you talked about, I think, is largely related to the people we interact with. Our parents, first of all, the peers we respect, maybe the religious leaders who have some meaning to us. And, I mean, you can just see that operating so often. I mean, how often do you find young married women saying, boy, I find myself saying things that my mother said to me. You know, I use the same language. I use the same categories. I even have the same tone of voice that she has very often. You know, I mean, a lot of us would say we become more like our parents very often as we go along in life. And in other words, it suggests to me the tremendous influence that's involved there. Well, I mean, put it in a far more negative vein, we have the idea that many youngsters who were abused, people who were abused as youngsters, end up being abusive parents. So it's not just a very sweetness and light analysis I'm doing. It's got a negative, heavy side to it as well. It's very often hard to break the cycle of violence that one finds in families. But there is no doubt that we are strongly influenced by the patterns we observe among the people around us.
There are people that I run into whom I find very attractive. There's something, I hesitate to use the word wholesome because it it sometimes has another meaning to it, like white bread or.
Yeah.
But I mean, there are people that are so solid and so wholesome. They're so integrated as persons. All of their parts fit together. What they say and what they do and what they really think. That stuff all gets expressed. They're terribly genuine people, and because they're so integrated, they have an integrity. That's the word. They have an integrity, and I want to be with that person. I want to talk to that person. I want to know that person, and it's precisely because of their virtue.
Yeah, there's a fascination that takes me back to the Bible and the tremendous impact that Jesus made on people. And there seems to have been a fascination about who is this guy? Why does he speak with this great authority? You know, how come he's got these tremendous insights? I thought he was a carpenter. I mean, what is this all about? So there was that impact, a personal impact. And very often, I think, throughout history, charismatic figures have done that. A lot of them we call saints. Some of them were founders of religious orders that gave us a whole style of moral life and a whole approach to moral decision-making based on particular virtues that they saw in Jesus and saw exemplified in the Scriptures and wanted to live out in their own communities. So you get that influence, that what you were just saying, just tremendously throughout the whole of Christian history.
I think of the old preacher's story of the woman walking with her daughter through a forest and through this little park area, and they came to this church and they go in to pray, and the little girl is of course looking around and she sees the stained glass windows and she says, well, who's that? And her mother says, that's St. Teresa. And who's that? That's St. Dominic, and so forth. And finally her mother realizes she never explained what saints were, and she said, well, do you know what saints are? And she says, yeah, Mommy, they're people that let the light shine through.
That's wonderful.
And each of them are a little different. There's a color. As the light comes through the window, there's a color that's St. Teresa's and some that's St. Dominic's. And the light all comes from God, obviously, but the particular virtues and gifts and the way they're configured are unique to each person. And what I like about that in terms of ethics, that story, is that not everybody is going to respond to God's call in exactly the same way. Sometimes we tend to say, well, here's the right thing, everyone must do this thing. Different people have different gifts, and their virtues, and that's what virtues are, their character strengths, they appear in different configurations. And it gives a real richness to the church, it seems to me.
And it gives a reality to it. I mean, I think people respond to flesh and blood examples more than they do to general principles. I think we all do that. And that's how we sort of pick up our cues about how to live. And I would suggest that one of the things that we need to do with this is to have a critical sense about it. I was saying how the young married woman finds herself doing more and more of what her mother did. Now, some of the things her mother did are no doubt good, and she should continue those. Some probably aren't so good, and she should be ready to critique them. So it seems as though if we're going to really learn from these people, we have to be able to criticize their negativity. We have to be able to see when they were off the track. I mean, there's some people who they didn't have, none of these saints, even these great people, had it all together. I mean, they just simply didn't. St. Jerome had a horrible temper and didn't always deal well with it. St. Augustine did not have the healthiest attitudes towards sexuality because of his history. And so on. So you could take the great saints that we know, and you're going to find a dark side to all of them. And so what you have to be critical. We don't want to follow their dark side. We don't want to, be greatly influenced by St. Augustine and think that sexuality is somehow debased or so on. We want to have a higher outlook on that. So this critical sense seems to me to be crucial as we interact both with the great saints and our parents and our peers as well.
Well, as you say those things, it comes to mind, that it's come to light recently that perhaps Martin Luther King was not absolutely sexually faithful to his wife, and so people say, aha, we can throw everything that he said and done away. Oh, no. If that is in fact the case, there's great virtue, there's wonderful stuff to be learned there, and things that I can grow from by emulating him. There might be dark areas, there might be problem areas, but frankly, that's life on the planet. We especially Catholics, there's this perfection thing. Either you're absolutely good or you're absolutely evil. And I think the whole doctrine of original sin is about the fact that the good and the evil coexist. It's the parable of the weeds and the wheat. And that's the case in all of us.
It is indeed. There was a scholastic saying that really hurt us along this line. One of the words, it said that from any defect whatsoever, something is bad. And that you had good only if all of the causes or elements were integral and present. In other words, there was actually a scholastic teaching along that line, which is in Latin phrases, which I'll spare by saying, but the bonum est integra causa. The good comes from having all the causes or elements in order. After I said I wouldn't use it, I said it. But anyway, the problem was that it suggested that you only had good if everything was together, and any defect made a person bad. So that you looked at a human being, your example, Martin Luther King, and allegations about certain aspects of his life, and then you're going to say, well, everything he said about civil rights is no good. It's ruled out. That's a common tendency. And unfortunately, in our Catholic community, we had certain teaching and common preaching that reinforced that idea. So if someone had a drinking problem, well, there would be no way to learn anything from them. On the other hand, I've known alcoholics with a drinking problem who have been tremendous people, who I would learn a lot from about courage, about sticking with problems, about sensitivity, fidelity, and so on, all kind of good things. Whereas if you just look at it and say, well, as an alcoholic, what can you learn from him or her, then you lose so much about what we can learn about moral decision-making from other people. In fact, you rule everybody out because everybody's got some defect, and then you'd say, well, why should I listen to them? Why should I learn anything from them? Whereas Aristotle's insight is, find the just person. They might not do too well with some other particular problem, like dealing with authority, but boy, they are just. That's what you want to learn from them. Find a just person, then you'll know what justice is about, then you'll know something about how you want to live in just fashion, treating people with equity and fairness.
And again, those virtues are things that draw us to those people. When I talk about prudence in an ethics class, I at one point I wanted to name one of our kids Prudence, and my wife wouldn't let me. Because everybody,
you love the virtue of prudence.
I think so. I think it stands at the very heart of things.
Aquinas said that. It is chief among all the moral virtues is prudence.
What I used to give as an example for that, because people think a prude is somebody who's just so standoffish and Indiana Jones from the movies, here's somebody that's prudent, it seems to me. He never tries to do something that he can't ultimately pull off. He might just barely pull it off in the end, and he may have found a better way to do it ultimately. But there's a brashness, and there's something that says, this is the right thing, it should be done, this is the best way I can figure out how to do it, and I'm going to do it. And so you see him running down this hallway with this immense boulder behind him. You say, isn't that stupid? No, he gets out of it alive. Yeah. So that's the prudent way to do it.
Would we call this a modern morality play, the Indiana Jones series?
Absolutely. With its flaws, Sure. He gets drunk, and he goes from woman to woman, and he's got all kinds of other problems, ego problems, yeah. But it is a modern morality play.
The prudence virtue, I think, really is crucial, and Thomas Aquinas saw it that way because it enables us to sort out things. It enables us to discern in given situations what all the circumstances are. In other words, to be a morally good person, we have to have certain insights. It might be intuitive, but we have to have insights into the circumstances we find ourselves in, into the consequences of what might happen if we proceed in a given way. Let's take spouses who aren't getting along. I mean, one spouse has to say, should I give him time to get his head together, quiet down, go for a walk, or should I bug him right now? We're going to talk about it right now because I want to get it out in the open and so on. I have this need. There's a prudential judgment about that. It could well be that what we end up saying, no, I got to give you time, let it go, and then we'll be able to talk more rationally later on. So that we're constantly called upon to make those kind of judgments. And the morally good person learns the fitting thing to do. That category of the fitting is a typically American category. The American ethicists have liked that notion of find the fitting thing to do. H. Richard Niebuhr talked about it that way. In any situation, how do I hit the target like the archer? That's what is called for. Incidentally, the biblical notion of sin is to miss the target, to miss the mark.
I'm wondering, was it Thomas who said that prudence can't be taught, or at least he wondered if it couldn't be?
I think he said you learned it by experience gradually over a period of time. There was an experiential component in it.
Caught more than taught.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's true. That's why some people said you really couldn't study ethics until you were older. That was one of the parts of the wisdom too. You had to have experience, but we do learn by experience. But that again puts morality, I think, into a wonderful developmental framework. We don't expect to be perfect at a given age. On the other hand, we don't want to be in a rut and say, I've got it all together. It's sort of an ongoing process of finding out what you do. One of the things Carl Rogers said about maturity was that he said the mature person is able to trust her instincts. She just sees that her instincts are right, and she knows which instincts don't function well. And I think that really becomes part of this whole outlook we're looking at. It's able to live spontaneously. The person who, for example, has their drinking under control, they don't have to have a big conference with themselves before they go to a party. Now, I got to limit it to 2. I got to watch it. I'll carry a glass around with me and leave it half full for a long time. They don't have to do that. Just go to the party, and at the end of the night after, whenever they go to parties, they always come home and they've drunk moderately. They've never overdone it, so they can trust their intuitions. Some other people go to the party and they say, I got to watch myself every minute, or I will have too much and I'll get drunk and make a fool of myself or embarrass my spouse or whatever else is involved in it. We have to know. Prudence is to know which of our intuitions we can trust and which we can't.
And we're really talking about morality at this point, because we're saying something, after I've looked at the situations and the rules and whatever, I'm making decisions for what I think I ought to do, to be responsible, to live responsibly. That's morality. You see, it's coming from within me, and I'm standing up and I'm a mature adult, mature person saying, this is what I think is the good, and I need now to pursue that. As opposed to saying, here's a law, so I have to do what the law says. Right. I say, well, what about the situation? What about other people involved? What about the circumstances?
Yeah, part of that insight is to knowing myself, too. I got to know circumstances, consequences. I got to know myself. How do I usually err? I mean, somebody says, the question is, should I confront my friend or not who makes me very angry? Well, one of the key questions is, do I usually confront too much, or am I too timid? That becomes one of my clues. If I'm too timid, and I'm always too timid, I never speak up for myself, that dictates I better confront here. There's a better chance. I got to consider other things, too. How are you going to react if I confront you? So all of those things have to be weighed in. That's why morality is very complex, and that's why you root it back in the example of people. Because you can look around and see somebody who handles confrontations well. And then you say, aha, I learned from their example.
Empathy is, you talk about the mature person. Moralists, probably as a result of work that Gilligan and some others have done, are saying that empathy really stands at the very heart of the moral enterprise. When you look at the television and I see in the current Gulf crisis mothers of Iraqis and mothers of Americans grieving, those don't look different to me.
That's right.
Can you empathize with both of those folks? Can you feel what they're feeling? It says that killing, there's a problem with it precisely because this is the result, this is where it goes. And if you can feel that, then you can begin to deal with the issues. But if you say, well, those are Arabs, we can kill them because they're Arabs, and you don't feel anything, then the moral enterprise, we've got to go back about 6 spaces here. Right.
It puts in a very good personalistic context, and I think that, you could apply it to many things. I mean, how should you be sensitive to other people or not? Well, if you have empathy, you realize that somehow in others, if you put someone down in a group or in conversation, it hurts them. And it bugs them. They might not sleep so well that night because they were made a fool of in public or something. So you can apply it to so many different things. This empathy for the poor, the option for the poor. Jeff, I want to get back to your big emphasis on virtue because I think it's crucial, and it's one of the great developments in moral theology these days. When Thomas Aquinas did his moral thinking based on Aristotle, virtue was at the center of it. That's how he went about it all. And he looked at the great theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, and the great moral virtues of fortitude, prudence, justice, and temperance. And then he developed a whole system out of that. And I think there was something valuable about it. And we lost it in a period of time in our moral thinking, and we're getting back to it. And I think it's a marvelous revival of an important idea. Of course, when we talk virtue, we're talking habit. our habits are assured capacities to function well in various situations. We call these virtues second natures. It is like, for example, to put on the mind of Christ and almost automatically view the world in the ways that we read in the Scriptures that Jesus did it. It is to show us that morality, when it's working best, flows. There's a harmony to it. It's not grit your teeth. I don't want to do this, but I got to do it anyway. A grit your teeth morality is opposed to the notion of virtue, where virtue goes then easily in a sense. It's co-natural. It's just part of our very being, and we don't have to fight ourselves to be nice to an enemy, because no, we see that that's the way Jesus acted, and we get sort of used to at least trying to do it. It's a tough example I picked, but it's still we're used to trying to do it.
And it's good for people as they grow to have that perspective that at some point in their life it might be very hard to do what this right thing is, and you struggle toward it, and you fall, and you start again. But at some point, some of those things that you didn't want to do before now become a second nature, and it's a sign that you are growing and that you're maturing, and that God's grace and the work of the Spirit is being accomplished in you. But you don't decide on your basic goodness or badness as a person as to how many of these laws can I follow cheerfully. Say, well, I'm on my way someplace, and at the moment this is where I am, and down the road I hope I'll be there, but I'm not there
so
yet.
I think of this as trying to cultivate virtue in a sense, to gradually put on the mind of Christ, to live out the virtues of good people that I see around me, of taking on some of their characteristics. There's again a traditional saying that action follows being. And that in this case, what we would say is that that this morality centers in on character, on personality, on the kind of person we are is the first question before what our particular actions are. A lot of people are using the sacrament of penance that way these days. They're trying to, in the Catholic community, they're trying to ask themselves, what are my virtues and vices? What are my character traits? And then the actions seem to follow. It's a mistake to put the first emphasis on how many times one did some particular action wrong. It is much more important to look at what kind of persons we are. And so that becomes primary.
James Gustafson says that the ethical question is what is God asking and empowering me? Who is He empowering me to be?
Yeah.
And then to do.
First, yeah.
That both of those things have to be addressed in almost parallel fashion in a sense as we grow. Because the one leads to the other, but you can be a behaviorist and say the things that I do make me into the person that I am. Mm-hmm. And so it's a chicken and an egg kind of thing.
There is a dialectical connection between those two. That's a good point. However, I guess I want to put a certain primacy on being, a certain primacy on the way we are, on our character. In other words, if I can get my general character to be honest, and I'm generally honest with people and function that way at work and in various settings, then the actions will sort of follow from that. I just naturally am not going to steal or deal with people through appearances rather than reality.
I like to play with the words. If we pursue virtue, and that's a graced thing, it's not something I do that makes me better, it's something God acting in me does, then I become virtuous. If I pursue vice, I become vicious.
Mm-hmm.
It breaks down not only my own person, but then the activities that flow out of that begin to tear people down.
Sure. If you keep telling lies, someday you wake up and you look in the mirror and you say, I am a liar. Mm-hmm. And at that point, then you're in bad shape, because now that becomes your habitual way of dealing with people. They can't trust you. You have to try to cover your tracks, and it's a terrible kind of situation. But I guess what flows out of our emphasis on virtue here is the need to cultivate virtue then. And I get back to your point then that I'm sort of buying into there's a dialectical relationship, and therefore one of the ways I cultivate it is to practice it. So I want to become a more prayerful person, because I look at prayerful people and they seem more at peace. They handle situations better. They seem closer and more in tune with God. So I want to be a prayerful person. Now, how do I do that? Well, I begin praying regularly. I set up a regimen. I try to pray 15 minutes every day. and I try to read some spiritual reading that will lead me into richer and deeper prayer. And maybe after I pray every day for 15 minutes for quite a while, I suddenly wake up one day and say, I'm a more prayerful person. I really have moved in that direction. I notice I don't snap at people as much. I notice I'm calmer. I deal better with people who are different from me. I tolerate things better because I become a more prayerful person.
And the up and down of that, at least as I experience, is that you see someone who's prayerful and want to be like them, and you struggle toward that. But maybe that might not be your gift. The way that you're going to be prayerful might be different than the way that they're prayerful. And so you want to see that example and let that inspire you, and then let the light shine through you in a way that's appropriate to who you are. And you'll discover a prayer life that is uniquely your own and that will work with others. But there's always a danger in using another for an example that you'll impose a mold on top of yourself, and then whatever view that sticks out of the mold we kind of cut off.
Right.
And that's not appropriate.
Very destructive. Although it takes us back to your story of the stained glass windows and the little girl and the light representing God shining through people in different ways. What we find in the history of Christianity, of course, are many different prayer styles and many different ways of living out the Christian life in the world as well. And it's sort of a matter of maybe combining, picking or choosing or whatever. So that I would think that part of the way around the problem you suggest there is recognizing there's diversity, and no one person knew exactly how to be just or temperate or chaste and so on, and there's been many ways of doing that, and therefore we don't have to feel bound to any one way. The example of Christ is shown through many people.
I always struggle with, and this is the argument in Christianity between grace and my will, God's will and my will. Do I chase something, or do I wait for God to catch me and say this is the way that we ought to go?
Yes, indeed. And maybe again as we have a dialectic between that. We have to try to make our own efforts and also rely always on God, who's in control of our lives. Well, Jeff, we've been talking about moral decision making. And what we've suggested is that we learn a lot from the example of other people, that the great saints have guided us in this. And we see a great variety of ways that they have lived out the law of love. So Christ is our great example. We look to him. He made tremendous impact. He guides us and shows us how to live. That's sort of refracted through all the Christians who have gone before us, the great ones as well as the ones we're close to, our friends, peers, our parents, who in various ways have shown us how to live the life of virtue.